The sun was beginning to set over Greenville County, casting long golden streaks across Woodruff Road. Inside her car, Katie Blauvelt snapped a quick selfie, the last photo she would ever take. To anyone passing by, she looked like any other young woman finishing a normal workday. Little did she know the danger was already closing in. Somewhere nearby, a man watched and waited. The same man she had once trusted, loved, and feared. By nightfall, Katie would vanish without a trace. Her car would be found abandoned, her phone would go silent, and the quiet stretch of South Carolina would become the setting for a story so dark investigators would remember it for years to come. But what led to her sudden disappearance? What happened between that final photograph and the moment police made their discovery? The truth would reveal a web of obsession, betrayal, and unimaginable cruelty. Katie Blauvelt was born on August 8, 1994 in the small town of Mountville, South Carolina. Her family, her brother Brandon and sister Brittany, adored her. Her warmth, kindness, and easy ability to make others feel seen made her a beloved figure. Everyone around her seemed to agree Katie's laughter was infectious and her outlook on life bright. Growing up, Katie had dreams of serving her country, a calling that eventually led her to meet John Blauvelt, a local Army recruiter. John was the picture of confidence, discipline, and charm, a man who could inspire those around him. He was 26, well-spoken, and carried himself in a way that made people naturally trust him. When Katie met him at a restaurant near his recruiting office, it seemed like fate. The two hit it off immediately. John was the type of man she admired, purposeful, stable, and full of pride in service. Encouraged by his guidance, Katie joined the Army in 2015. But after just 2 months of service, a spinal condition forced her into a medical discharge. Katie returned home discouraged and unsure of her future, but John stayed by her side, providing comfort and support. Their bond grew stronger, and within a year they were married. Katie moved into John's home in Simpsonville, hopeful about their new life together. She imagined cozy evenings, plans for children, and a home filled with love. But soon that dream began to shatter. The man who had once seemed so stable, so dependable, began to change. He started inviting teenagers over to their house, high school students who looked up to him as the cool recruiter. What began as innocent hangouts soon turned into wild parties filled with alcohol, marijuana, and harder drugs. Katie, who had pictured herself building a peaceful home, now found herself in the middle of chaos. Among the regular visitors was 17-year-old Hannah Thompson, a student from Hillrest High School, the same school where John often recruited. Investigators would later describe Hannah as being completely infatuated with John. She followed him everywhere, doted on him, and as many later recalled, seemed to be willing to do anything he asked. But for Katie, this new dynamic was unbearable. The tension grew. Katie couldn't stand the parties, the drugs, or the constant presence of these teenagers. So she made the difficult decision to leave. Within weeks, Hannah moved into their home, stepping into Katie's place with little hesitation. But what happened next would be far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Katie's life, once filled with hope and dreams, was about to take a dark and unexpected turn.
As Katie tried to rebuild her life after leaving John, something far darker was unfolding in the background. The man who once seemed like her protector, the man she had once trusted, was unraveling. The cracks in John Blauvelt's character grew deeper, fueled by a deadly obsession and an insatiable thirst for revenge. John's downfall began the day Katie filed a domestic violence report. During a heated argument, he had pointed a gun at her head, a moment that left her terrified but alive. She managed to escape, but her complaint added a new charge to John's growing list of offenses. Soon after, the Army launched an internal review, stripping John of his recruiting duties. His career, which once seemed so promising, was now on the line. His income was cut, his reputation shattered. The man who had once commanded respect was now a disgraced figure. John was furious. He started telling anyone who would listen that Katie had ruined his life, that he would seek revenge. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but it was far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. As Katie took steps to protect herself, securing a restraining order, John's obsession began to shift into something far more chilling. Investigators would later uncover a disturbing pattern. His internet searches painted a haunting picture. In the weeks before Katie's death, John had been looking up phrases like, "How to sharpen a knife," and "What do I do when my wife dies?" These were not random queries. They were the early signs of a plan. a plan that would change everything. Meanwhile, the house that Katie had once called home became a dark, chaotic place. The wild parties continued, and the teenagers remained, no longer just guests, but a fixture in John's increasingly unstable world. Marijuana, alcohol, LSD, and cocaine flowed freely in the house. Katie's friend, 16-year-old Allie Somerville, later testified that Jay's house had become a house of constant chaos, where anything went. John had lost all control, and the people around him were caught in his downward spiral. Katie once again made the decision to leave, but this time it wasn't just about escaping the chaos. She was terrified of what John had become. By October 2016, Katie had finally filed for separation, marking a significant turning point in her life. Her legal steps, including the restraining order, gave her some peace. Her friends noticed the change. She smiled more, talked about her future, and seemed to be reclaiming the life that had once been overshadowed by fear. But John wasn't finished yet. Behind closed doors, his rage continued to build, and his plans grew more methodical. In the days before Katie's murder, investigators discovered he had been obsessed with tracking the progress of the investigation into her disappearance. He regularly searched news articles, learning how the authorities were piecing together the case. But his focus wasn't just on Katie. He became consumed with the idea of exacting revenge, and that obsession would push him past the point of no return. John's final move was about to take shape. He knew what he had to do. He would make sure Katie would never have a chance to escape the nightmare he had created.
October 23, 2016 began like any other day for Katie Blauvelt. She woke up early, ready to work at PetSmart, a job she loved. Surrounded by animals, Katie had found peace, and that day was no different. Her coworkers described her as cheerful as ever, someone whose presence brightened even the busiest of days. At around 2:15 p.m., she clocked out, expecting to meet friends later that evening. But as hours passed and Katie failed to show up, something was terribly wrong. Calls and messages went unanswered. For Katie's family, this wasn't like her. Katie would never disappear without a word. Alarm bells went off, and by nightfall her parents reported her missing. They had no idea that earlier that afternoon a sinister plan was already set in motion, and Katie was on the brink of danger. At 2:45 p.m., Hannah Thompson, the same 17-year-old girl who had once lived with Katie and John, drove John to Katie's workplace on Woodruff Road. John had been waiting for the right moment, and now, with Katie so close, the time had come. Hannah, deeply enmeshed in John's world, dropped him off and left, unaware of what was about to unfold. The last known trace of Katie was a simple selfie taken just after 4 p.m. inside her car. She seemed calm, unaware of the horror waiting for her. Her phone, which was still active at that time, gave no indication of what had happened next. By 5:03 p.m., John made a call to Hannah. A minute later, he sent her a Snapchat message saying, "Check out your Snapchat." The message was deleted from his phone, but investigators believe it contained evidence that was never recovered. A dark glimpse into the moment of horror. Not far from the city, on the outskirts of Simpsonville, an old abandoned farmhouse sat untouched for over 20 years. Katie had played there as a child, a quiet spot that had become eerily significant in her last moments. It was here, inside the decaying walls of the farmhouse, that John would end her life. Inside that farmhouse, a brutal attack unfolded. Investigators later found evidence beneath Katie's fingernails, proof of her desperate fight for survival. She had tried to escape, tried to fight off her attacker, but John was stronger. He overpowered her and stabbed her to death in a fit of rage, fueled by obsession and revenge. After the murder, John's actions became even more calculated. He dragged Katie's lifeless body through a small basement window and shoved it into a rectangular concrete box in the center of the basement. It was a cold, hidden tomb, where Katie's body would remain until it was discovered days later. John's next move was just as chilling. He carefully cleaned up the scene, leaving no trace behind. He drove Katie's car to a parking lot on White Horse Road, abandoned it there, and vanished into the shadows. But he wasn't alone. Hannah followed him in another car, helping him cover his tracks. For 2 agonizing days, Katie's family and friends lived in uncertainty, hoping for a miracle. With each passing hour, the fear grew. But the breakthrough they needed came on October 26, 2016, when a mutual friend of Katie and John's, Wayne Ruhr, decided to search the farmhouse. What he found would end the search and break the hearts of everyone who loved Katie.
John Blauvelt had done the unthinkable. He had killed his wife, and now he was on the run. The man who once held a position of authority, the man who had seemed so controlled, was now a fugitive, and he wasn't alone. With him was 17-year-old Hannah Thompson, the same teenager who had once idolized him, a girl whose life would now be tied to his darkest secret. John had planned the murder carefully, but his escape was far from flawless. The police were already piecing together the disturbing events of the past few days, and it wasn't long before their focus turned to him. Investigators knew they had to act fast. With John's military training, his knowledge of survival tactics, and his ability to cover his tracks, they knew capturing him wouldn't be easy. Hannah, though, seemed to have vanished into thin air too. The teenager who had once been a part of John's twisted world was now missing. Her parents reported her disappearance just hours after John had fled, confirming their worst fears. Hannah wasn't just running from her own life, she was running with John. As the days turned into weeks, the search for John and Hannah intensified. Detectives worked tirelessly to track their movements, but the trail went cold. The pair moved across the country, living off the grid, staying in isolated areas. John's knowledge of military survival tactics made him particularly elusive. He knew how to disappear, how to blend into the background. Every time investigators thought they were getting close, the trail would go dark. Despite their best efforts, John and Hannah seemed to slip through their fingers time and time again. The case, which had captured national attention, became one of the largest manhunts in South Carolina's history. Law enforcement agencies from across the country joined in the search, but for months, John's whereabouts remained a mystery. Then, on December 12, 2016, after weeks of living in the shadows, a breakthrough came. Hannah Thompson resurfaced in Eugene, Oregon. She had been abandoned by John, exhausted, scared, and ready to return home. She found refuge in a family friend's house and, after a long period of silence, finally contacted her parents. But when investigators questioned her about John's whereabouts, Hannah lied. She claimed that John had simply disappeared one morning, leaving her behind. It was a lie that would take years to unravel. At the time, it seemed like a stroke of luck. Hannah had returned, and investigators could now focus on her. But the truth remained hidden, and the search for John continued. By 2019, the case was still unsolved, but the story was far from over. The case had gained national attention after being featured on In Pursuit with John Walsh. As the investigation gained renewed momentum, new tips began to flood in from across the United States. Still, no one knew where John was hiding, and his capture seemed increasingly elusive. Katie's family, especially her mother Patricia, refused to give up. Despite the heartbreak, they were relentless in their pursuit of justice. Patricia, along with activist Tracy Fant, launched the Justice for Katie campaign, keeping the pressure on law enforcement and ensuring Katie's story would not be forgotten. But there was still one key player in this puzzle, Hannah, and as the investigation progressed, it became clear that she knew far more than she had let on.
6 years. 6 long years of uncertainty, heartbreak, and relentless pursuit. After vanishing without a trace, John Blauvelt had managed to escape justice, until, finally, the long arm of the law caught up with him. What John thought was a foolproof escape had crumbled, and he had nowhere left to hide. John Blauvelt's life on the run was anything but easy. He and Hannah Thompson had been living as fugitives, drifting across the country, constantly on the move, hiding from a justice system that was closing in on them. For years, it seemed like John was untouchable, but the passage of time wasn't working in his favor. Investigators were determined, and technology was advancing. As new resources became available, so did new hope. In early 2022, the case gained new momentum when a specialized U.S. Marshals Cold Case Task Force took over. With advanced tracking tools and fresh eyes on the case, they began reviewing every lead. And that's when one name kept popping up: Hannah Thompson. Despite her earlier lies and attempts to distance herself from John, Hannah remained in contact with him for years. It was a critical lead, one that would break the case wide open. After months of intense investigation, Hannah finally agreed to cooperate with authorities. Her information would prove to be the key that unlocked the mystery. Hannah's cooperation led the marshals to Medford, Oregon. There, John had been living under the false identity of Ben Klein. He had settled into a quiet neighborhood, blending in with the locals, all while continuing to evade capture. For years, he had managed to live a double life, fooling everyone around him. But on July 20th, 2022, the game came to an end. Law enforcement, armed with fresh intelligence, surrounded John's home in Medford. They watched as a man who matched John's description came and went from the house. The confirmation came when investigators spotted one distinct feature: a tattoo on his arm, a pirate tattoo, identical to the one that John had worn in his police file from 2016. It was all the confirmation they needed. The operation was swift. At 4 p.m., officers moved in, surrounding the home. John tried to lie his way out, insisting his name was Ben, but the officers already knew the truth. After 6 years of evading capture, John Blauvelt was finally caught. Inside the house, they found a woman, someone who had been living with John for the last 6 years. She had only known him as Ben and was devastated when she learned the truth about the man she had shared her life with. The arrest marked the end of a chapter, but it wasn't the end of the story. 3 months later, in October 2022, Hannah Thompson was arrested and charged with 5 felony counts, including obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. The girl who had once idolized John and helped him evade justice was now facing the consequences of her role in Katie's murder. She would later testify against him in court, facing the consequences of her own involvement. John's trial began on September 16, 2024, nearly 8 years since Katie's murder. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case. Among the most powerful moments in the trial was when Hannah took the stand, recounting the chilling details of John's confession, his plans, and his actions. Despite the defense's arguments, the evidence against John was undeniable. His internet searches, his journal entries, and the messages that he had sent to Hannah left no room for doubt. On September 20th, 2024, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced John to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Katie's family, it was a small victory in a long and painful journey, but it wasn't enough to heal the wounds left by Katie's brutal death. But the story didn't end there. Just a year later, in August 2025, came the final twist. Hannah, once facing 55 years in prison, struck a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and concealing a felony, and in a stunning move, received only 3 years of probation. For Katie's family, it was a devastating blow. Her mother, Patricia, called it a slap in the wrist, a bitter reminder that justice for Katie was still far from complete. But even so, Patricia and her supporters continued to fight for justice. Katie's name is kept alive through the Justice for Katie campaign, ensuring that her story and the stories of victims like her will never be forgotten.